Revelation 13. We were talking last week about some of the characteristics of the dragon and how, as you identify other main characters in the Revelation, they're good guys or they're bad guys. If they're in white, you know that they're good guys. If they are 7 heads and 10 horns, they're probably bad guys, because that's the description we get of Satan in chapter 12. An enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on its heads. Whatever that means, however you interpret the heads and the crowns and the horns, when you get somebody else that looks like that, then you can say, well, there's the offspring of Satan. There's someone who's connected to Satan's side of the equation. And as you go through, you may, the saints are not all going to look exactly like Jesus, but they're going to have different characteristics that remind you of Jesus. So we're going to look at the 3 main bad guys in the Revelation tonight. And there's 2 beasts and then a prostitute, the great whore of Babylon, as she's known. We'll talk about her a little bit. Chapter 13 has to do mainly with the beasts, and we'll try to identify, at least in general, who those guys are. And then chapter 17, we meet the prostitute. In between there, you have the good guys show up. So you have chapter 13, the beasts. Chapter 14, we see Jesus with the 144,000. And so we go back and forth, but I want us to look at all 3 of the main bad guys first, and then we'll go back and look a little bit more closely at some of the rest of it. All right, so chapter 13, the dragon stood on the shore of the sea, and I saw a beast coming out of the sea. It had 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 crowns on its horns, and on each head a blasphemous name. So not only does it have similarities to Satan, it has things that are a little bit worse than Satan, because Satan didn't get mentioned as having the blasphemous names. So you've got Satan influencing someone here. He's standing on the shore of the sea waiting on him. When he comes up out of the sea, he is described as one that looks a great deal like Satan, but also on each of his heads he has a blasphemous name. What does blasphemy mean? When we talk about blasphemy against the Holy Spirit or blaspheming God, what does that mean? What does that mean? Yes, exactly. It's a more severe way of saying to belittle or to undermine, to insult. Right? So when the leaders of the Jews came to Jesus and said, you're casting out demons by the power of Satan, he said, well, you can say things about me if you want to, but blasphemy against the Holy Spirit, saying evil things about the Holy Spirit, that you're not going to be forgiven for. So blasphemy is speaking evil. So each...
That's the unforgiven sin.
Yes, blasphemy against the Holy Spirit is the only sin in the New Testament where there's no forgiveness offered. Jesus says you won't be forgiven in this age or in the age to come.
You're gone.
Yeah. So whoever this beast is, right, whatever this beast represents, he is connected to Satan and doing the most heinous thing you can do, right? So he's not just casually blasphemous. There's a blasphemous name on every head of this beast. All right. Verse 2, the beast I saw resembled a leopard, but had feet like those of a bear and a mouth like that of a lion. The dragon gave the beast his power and his throne and great authority. So we won't worry about the identification of the animals that he resembled, but just to say Satan gave him his power and his authority. So again, he looks like Satan. He's empowered by Satan. Verse 3, one of the heads of the beast seemed to have had a fatal wound, but the fatal wound had been healed. The whole world was filled with wonder and followed the beast. People worshiped the dragon because he had given authority to the beast. And they also worshiped the beast. And they asked, who is like the beast? Who can wage war against it? Okay, so we've got one who's given power by Satan, who blasphemes, who wages war, who is undefeatable. Does it sound familiar from Jesus' time frame? Sounds a whole lot like Rome, doesn't it? Right? This persecutor of Christians, this megalith of a nation that could not possibly be beaten. In fact, that was one of their slogans, who is able to defeat Rome? And at that point in time, really there was no one. The beast was given a mouth to utter proud words and blasphemies, and to exercise its authority for 42 months, also known as 3.5 years, also known as 1,260 days, also known as times, and half a time. All right. It opened its mouth to blaspheme God and to slander slander his name and his dwelling place and those who live in heaven. It was given power to wage war against God's holy people and to conquer them. It was given authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. All the inhabitants of the earth will worship that beast, all whose names have not been written in the Lamb's book of life, the Lamb who was slain from the creation of the world. Whoever has ears, let them hear. If anyone is to go into captivity they will go. If anyone is to be killed with the sword they will be killed. This calls for patient endurance and faithfulness on the part of God's people. One little snippet from there, he identifies two categories. First of all, he says that they wage war against God's holy people and conquer them. And then he says, every other tribe, people, nation, or language, he conquers everybody. But he starts out with, God's people have been conquered by this foe. If we're talking about the late time of writing, 96, during the reign of Domitian, then Jerusalem would have already been wiped out. There would be, if you went to Jerusalem in 96 AD, there would have been a very desolate place there. In fact, all the way from the destruction of Jerusalem in 70, all the way up into the 1800s, it was not a place that was well inhabited or well cared for. Lots of people fighting over it back and forth to try to own that piece of real estate. But as far as a beautiful, thriving city like it was, say, in 69 AD, it doesn't return to that grandeur for a lot of time. So he's able to wage war against God's holy people, conquered them, and then was given authority over everybody, every tribe, every people, every language, every nation. Okay. Now look over at chapter 17. And we'll pick up just one quick clue. This calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 hills on which the woman sits. We'll go back and talk about the woman in a minute. But she's riding on this beast, right? The beast with 7 heads and 10 horns. And this beast sits on 7 hills. What do we know about Rome? It was the city that was built on 7 hills. So there's very little doubt that the first beast is the Roman Empire. Right? You might say it's one of the emperors. You might say that it is a time frame inside the Roman Empire. But during the first century, when Jesus was alive, and for the next couple of centuries after that, Rome was just it. They kept broadening their scope of influence, and they were in charge of pretty much everybody. So not only did they defeat Israel and level Jerusalem, but if you stood up against Rome, that was what was going to happen to you too. So Rome is the great power, and I believe the beast that came up out of the sea. Typically in prophecy, when you see the idea of something coming out of the sea, it means up out of the nations. So out of all the nations of the earth, out of all the possibilities that are out there in that sea, Rome rises to the top. Why do they rise to the top? Because they're a persecutor. And Satan is giving them the power to do this. Now, a couple of weeks ago, we studied Romans 13, and it says there's no power except that which is given by God. Right? God has sent Satan to the earth, right? Kicked him out of heaven. He's going to persecute God's people. How's he going to get that done? Well, he's going to use nations that are, I would say, predisposed to being used by him. In our generation or in our lifetime, think about the communist nations. Right? The amount of persecution against Christians in the world today is huge. We don't hear about it here because we don't see it that much in Wheeler County. But there are places in the world where to openly proclaim that you're a Christian is going to get you arrested. It may get you beat up, and it may get you killed. Right? There is a lot of our brothers and sisters who are not openly speaking of their faith because they know that it will get them killed if they do. Right?
Do you reckon in this chapter 17, that she sits on 7 hills, do you reckon that kind of referring to Rome?
Absolutely. The city of Rome itself sat on 7 hills.
That's what I was.
Absolutely. All right. Well, let's look at the second beast. Right? The second beast, well, let me remind you about something about the first beast first. The first beast caused the nations to worship the dragon. Right? So he is an emissary of Satan. When we get to the second beast, we'll find out that the second beast causes people to worship the first beast. So we have kind of a pyramid scheme going here. You've got Satan who gives authority to the first beast, to Rome, and now Rome is going to give authority to another beast who is going to cause people to worship Rome. So we start in verse 11, chapter 13, verse 11. I saw a second beast coming out of the earth. It had 2 horns like a lamb, but it spoke like a dragon. It exercised all the authority of the first beast on its behalf, and made the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, whose fatal wound had been healed. And remind me not to forget to talk about that one. It performed great signs, even causing fire to come down from heaven to the earth in full view of the people. Because of the signs it was given power to perform on behalf of the first beast, it deceived the inhabitants of the earth. It ordered them to set up an image in honor of the beast who was wounded by the sword and yet lived. The second beast was given power to give breath to the image of the first beast, so that the image could speak and cause all who refused to worship the image to be killed. It also forced all people, great and small, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hands or on their foreheads, so that they could not buy or sell unless they had that mark, which is the name of the beast or the number of its name. This calls for wisdom. Let the person who has insight calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. That number is 666. And there's the most important, most discussed, most famous number in all of the Revelation, maybe in all of literature. I can't think of another number that gets that much play. You don't see too many T-shirts, with other numbers prominently displayed on them. It became kind of a catchword for the occult. The most important part of that is the number of a man. Right? So this man adds up to 666. And I know that you've heard lots of discussion about this, but in the Hebrew system, every letter also has a numeric equivalent. We don't have that in our language. I guess you could make those things. We did as kids. You could make up little mystery clues. A equals 1, B equals 2, and then you write out a letter, and they could decipher the message. But for the Hebrews, it was just built that way. Their language, every letter is also a number. When you take different individuals' names or titles and add them up, then you come up with a total number. When John wrote these letters to the folks in Asia Minor, he assumed that they could take those numbers of somebody's name and add them up. He said, this calls for wisdom, right? Take some time and add this up. Find somebody whose name adds up to 666. When John wrote this to the 7 churches of Asia, let's say 96 AD, he did not think Adolf Hitler was going to be the 666. He did not think that Genghis Khan was the 666. He didn't think that Muhammad was the 666. He thought there was somebody that they could add up and come up with 666. Right? Which brings us to this idea of there was one who was not, and now he is again. There was one who was killed with the sword but lived. There is an ancient legend about Caesar Nero. Caesar Nero was an absolute nutball. He was extremely paranoid, and the farther into his life he got, the more paranoid he became. One of the earliest big persecutions against Christians came from Caesar Nero because he was getting too paranoid about the growth of Christianity and whatever. So he blamed them for things that they had no control over, like the big fire in Rome. Well, it was the Jews and the Christians. That's who caused it. And so we've got to run the Jews out. We've got to kill the Christians. He was actually reported, and the more you get into persecution in the first century, the weirder it gets. But he was reported to have poured oil over Christians and lit them up in his gardens, to light the pathways in his gardens, because he hated Christians so much. He eventually killed himself, but not before he killed like his wife and a few kids and a few competitors. It was a time that Rome could really have fallen apart. After Nero died, there were 3 in a row that take up only about 2.5, 3 years for the 3 emperors that followed him. Each one assassinated the one before him. Right? So Rome was in a shambles after Caesar Nero. But the legend was that Nero came back because after a few guys didn't really persecute Christians, didn't do much of anything, then all of a sudden Domitian shows up. And Domitian is as mean as Nero. And so people said, well, Domitian must be the reincarnation of Nero. Or maybe they lied and Nero didn't die and he came back. But the theory is called Nero Redivivus. He was revived. So the Nero Redivivus myth shows up, I think, in Revelation. I think what John is saying is you see the persecution that's popping up under Domitian. This is the same spirit. This is the same thing that was going on back in the time of Nero. Nero killed Peter. Nero killed Paul. Nero killed lots of our brethren. Well, the number 666 fits his full title. Caesar, Nero, Lord, and God. If you add up the Hebrew numbers, you come up with 666. So he fits. Now, dozens of other bad guys through history also fit. So if you want to hang being the beast on somebody, just play with their name long enough and get it to add up to 666. But at their time frame and what was going on in their world, Nero and Domitian make sense. And I don't think Domitian's name adds up. But if he's the reincarnation of Nero and Nero's name adds up, then that's how the Nero Redivivus myth kind of works itself out. But notice the things that the new guy does. He calls people to worship the first guy. He calls people to set up images in honor of the new guy, of the first beast. So up until the time of Caesar Nero, when a Caesar would die, they would build him a temple. The next guy in line, his job, like for Nero, would be to say Claudius was more than a man, he was a god. And so we'll build him a temple and people could go worship Claudius. When Nero came to power, Nero said, I'm not waiting on the next guy. I'm already a god. You need to start worshiping me now. So Nero gives himself the title of God and begins to try to live as a God-man, as the emperor. Well, when you look at this second beast, his job is to make people worship the first beast. What's the first beast's job? Make people worship the dragon, right? So emperor worship equals satanic worship. They were making them worship the persecutors all the way up to the top. In the time of Domitian, in the time that I think this letter was written, they would come to your house and they would bring you a little piece of incense. You would burn a little incense and you would say, Caesar is Lord. And they would give you a certificate that said that you were on board with Caesar worship. And as a result, your life went along swimmingly. You didn't have a problem doing business. You didn't have a problem owning a business or going to the marketplace to buy food or whatever. If you didn't, then your first problem was that you couldn't go do business. Right? You're an outsider. You're an atheist. They called the Christians atheists because we only believed in one God. We didn't believe in, ever how many Caesars there had been up to that point, plus all of the pantheon of Rome and Greece. And, they had hundreds of different gods. But if you were so closed-minded that you wouldn't worship the emperor, then you couldn't have the assets of the Roman Empire at your disposal. So you go down to buy some meat, and the meat market guy says, have you worshipped Domitian? Have you been to the temple of Titus? Who's your favorite emperor? Well, I don't worship them. I only worship the Messiah. Oh, I'm sorry. Can't sell you any meat today. So it's not about, a stamp. It's not about a brand that they put on these people. It was about their identity, right? When God gets ready to start the war against the persecutors, he says, we got to stop for a minute and make sure we mark the 144,000. Right? So they get marked as the good guys. If you worship the 666, if you let yourself get into the emperor worship, then you're marked as the bad guy. So I don't think anyone should assume that there will be a time in history when they're going to show up at your house and brand you, or show up at your house and make you worship Biden or Kamala or whatever so that you can do business. This is something that was going on in the first century already. Is it possible that there is someone so powerful and so satanic that Satan will use them to try to make a comeback at the end of the world? Anything's possible. But what I think John is talking about in chapter 13 is the Caesar Nero Redivivus myth, and the idea that Domitian is now being worshipped as Nero wanted to be worshipped, and that people who buy into that are taking on themselves the 666 instead of the 777. Right? If 666 is always bad, 777 is always good. Right? One more. Let's look at chapter 17. And I didn't even make up my notes for this one, so I hope we're in the right place. We are. Okay. Chapter 17, starting in verse 1. One of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came to me and said, I'm going to show you the punishment of the great prostitute, who sits by many waters. With her the kings of the earth committed adultery, and the inhabitants of the earth were intoxicated with the wine of her adulteries. The angel carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was covered with blasphemous names and had 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was dressed in purple and scarlet, was glittering with gold, precious stones, and pearls. She held a golden cup in her hand filled with abominable things and the filth of her adulteries. The name written on her forehead was a mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes and of the abominations of the earth. What does Babylon stand for? What did they do? 586 BC, they conquered Judah, took God's people away into captivity. So they're like the original persecutors. Whenever you see Babylon, it's always bad. Either they are living a sinful lifestyle, therefore they're like Babylon, or they're persecutors, therefore they're like Babylon. This gal's both, right? I saw that the woman was drunk with the blood of God's holy people, the blood of those who bore testimony to Jesus. When I saw her, I was greatly astonished. Then the angel said to me, "Why are you so astonished? I will explain to you the mystery of the woman and of the beast she rides, which has the 7 heads and 10 horns. The beast which you saw once was, now is not, and yet will come up out of the abyss and go to its destruction. The inhabitants of the earth, whose names have not been written in the book of life from the creation of the world, will be astonished when they see the beast, because it once was, now is not, and yet will come. This calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 hills on which the woman sits. There are also 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, the other has not yet come, but when he does, he must remain for only a little while. The beast who once was and now is not is an 8th king. He belongs to the 7 and is going to his destruction. And then he goes on with the description. So who is this woman? She is all of the things that the first beast and the second beast represent if you follow them. She is the abomination. She is the party. She is the drunkenness with the persecution against the saints. All she wants is one more dead Christian. So, all in all, she is the Roman Empire. She is Roman worship. She is what Rome turned out to be, the ultimate in persecution. But she's a little more specific than that, right? She is one who was and is not, but is coming back, and all of those kind of things. So let's see if the numbers match up to anything that we're talking about. She was, let's see, 7 heads and 10 horns. The beast which you saw once was, now is not, and yet will come up out of the abyss and go to the destructions. The 8th is part of the 7. Here's the list of the Roman emperors. 1 through 5, Caesar Augustus, he got assassinated. Caesar Tiberius, who was on the throne all through Jesus' adult ministry anyway. Caligula, who was one of the most immoral people in history. Claudius, and then Nero. Then if you skip the 3 who killed each other in the ensuing 2 or 3 years, Galba, Otho, and Vitellius, you get to Vespasian. Right? So he would be number 6. Titus would be number 7, which makes Domitian the 8th one. Right? So he was one of the originals, and he was not, and now he is again. Kind of speaks to that Nero Redivivus myth, that somehow what we've got is number 5, who has come back as number 8. The one that follows Domitian is a guy named Nerva, and Nerva's only in there for about 1.5 years. So it's hard to make it all stick, right? About the time that you think you've got all the things lined up and they all match up and everything's just right, there's a little glitch. Why is there a glitch? Let's remind ourselves of that. There's a glitch because we're dealing with visions. And not only are we dealing with visions, we're dealing with visions about things that are 2,000 years old. If we had lived in Asia Minor in 95, 96 AD. And we received this letter. I think that the group of us could have looked at it and said, oh, well, let's add that up. Yeah, sure enough, that probably comes out to Domitian, or that may come out to Nerva. There's all kinds of things that they knew that were part of their world into which this letter arrived that we're just not that familiar with. So when you run into somebody who is completely convinced that they know exactly who this is, I worry about them. I have a new theory that I've been working on for the last couple of weeks, and I think I've got figured out some things that I didn't know before. My problem is I can't find any books by any real scholars that agree with me. So I must be wrong, but it seems so right. It's just difficult to get everything set up.
So why do you skip the 3?
Well, because it makes my numbers come out better.
Okay.
They skip that. Honestly, that's the only real answer is that scholars who have worked on this deal for centuries skip these 3 guys because they don't count them as real emperors. They never really got a foothold. They were never really much rulers at all. As soon as they got started, they got assassinated. Somebody else came in. And it's not until these 3 are gone that you have one who comes in and stays a while. Like Galba, he was in there for parts of 68 and 69. Otho was there from January to April of 69. Right, so he was there for parts of 4 months. And then you get to Vespasian. Vespasian is there for 10 years, 69 to 79. So between 68 and the middle of 69, you have 3. And then you have one guy that's there for 10 years. Right? So they just they mention them in their lists, and then they say, but nothing happened as a result of them being the proclaimed emperor. Some of them were emperor because they self-proclaimed, and then the guard that kind of ran Rome anyway, the royal guard showed up and told them that no, you're really not, and usually killed them and hung them on a pole somewhere to make sure everybody else knew that no, they're really not. And they would put in the guy that they thought should be emperor, but then that guy couldn't make it stick. The next guy assassinated them. So you don't count them because they weren't much count. They just didn't do much. But again, they held for a month or two the title of emperor, and if you count them, then you can't come up with the answers we come up with. So it's honestly the reason is because I have a theory and they don't fit in my theory very well. So you have to get rid of them, which is the reason that the Roman citizenry got rid of them. We don't like them. We're just going to get rid of them. We don't need them for anything. But yeah, that's part of the problem of trying to track down an individual. Share one more thing with you, and then we'll close. If you take the Roman numeric system, right? 1, and then the V is 5, is that right? Then 10 is X. The next one is L, I think, for 50. C for 100. And then I don't remember if there's one after that. But anyway, if you take the first 6 of the Roman numbers and add them together, guess what it comes up to? 666. It really does. So, you can play with that stuff all day and come up with all kinds of weird and wonderful things. But the bottom line is you've got Satan who is influencing an entire culture, not just politically, but religiously and morally. And the result of that influence is that they're persecuting Christians. So, Lord willing, next week, we'll start looking at God's response to that, because in the middle, in between the 2 beasts and the there's some interesting information in there. So remember, you'll have, oh no, we've got a problem, and then all of a sudden praise breaks out in heaven. Oh no, there's a problem, and then praise breaks out in heaven. And so we'll see next week that God is going to be doing things even while the dragon and the beasts and the harlot are trying to move people to persecute the church. Right? So we'll leave it there. We'll say goodbye to you guys. Talk to you later. Oh, there's Todd Miller, man. Hi, Todd. Be a good boy. Give your wife a hug for me.